Working with CSS allows us to control the visual display of the elements on our page. We can change their properties and we can change their layout or positioning. CSS is immensely powerful and is something that is going to cause you no end of grief as you work on it. So you've been warned. Part of the problem with working on CSS is it's not very forgiving. If you have even a single missing semicolon in your CSS, it becomes a random crapshoot of what part of your CSS still functions and what part doesn't. And it leaves you just wondering, or a missing comma, or just, it's very, very punctuation dependent. So it's going to cause you lots of grief. If you engage in adult language, you will probably partake in that. And at times, you will look at it and what you have on screen looks correct. It is correct. And the only way to get it to work is to delete what you have typed there and retype it fresh. When we're working with styles, we have 3 places that we put our styles. One of the places that we can put our styles would be inside a tag itself. So inside my tag, we can actually list style information here. Actually, I don't know if I need the semicolon here. Inline styles are considered really, and I can keep saying really for the rest of the night, bad form. We don't want to use them. The problem with using inline styles is if we want to change them and they're in the middle of our markup, 1, they're super hard to find. 2, because they're not centralized, they're unique to that word, that sentence, that paragraph on that given page. If I have 10,000 pages that comprise my website, that's really going to suck to try and clean that up. So they're highly discouraged, and we probably don't want to use them in most of what we do. But as you can see, I put style information in. So this is now what's referred to as an inline style. If I see inline styles in any of your projects, I'll let you know I'm profoundly disappointed in you and express my extreme displeasure. Second place that we can put our styles is we can now have a style section within our document. And our style format is we have the element or tag that we are trying to modify. We put a curly brace, and then we'll have a closing curly brace. Then within that, we are going to now modify a property. So maybe I will say something like color blue. If I save this and now add in an H1 here, you can see now it made it blue. The nice part about having my style up here is this: if all my styles are contained up in the head section between my style and close style tag, that gives me the possibility of finding things a little bit easier because I'm not hunting through individual elements or paragraphs to locate that little style that's making something look or behave a certain way. So these are 2 ways that we can go about doing this. Now, the third way that we are going to go about doing this is with an external style sheet, so we can link to that style sheet. And when we do that, it is really as easy as using our link tag information. And we can see that it puts up, gives us a route attribute of style sheet, and it gives us an href. This is the path to our style sheet. Now currently I don't have a CSS folder with a file called master CSS in it, so I'll probably want to make something, and I'll just call it my style CSS so that we have that link to it. Now there is no my style CSS yet, so if we just make something, And now we have that. Now I have a CSS file and I'm linking to this. As we work with this and put it in, it's recommended that we do the ubiquitous char set, so we're specifying the formatting and coding of the characters within our style sheet. Now if I want to make my style sheet useful, it's a good idea to put comments in our style sheet as we are working on it. The nice part when you're using a reasonably intelligent code editor is we can add in comments pretty easily. So if I make a section and call this main styles, my nav styles, now I'm just making a bunch of random elements based on possible things I may be including as markup within my document. And once I have something there, if I put my cursor in that line of text and hit Command/, it turns that into a comment. So we can see CSS comments are /* and end with */. So I hit Command/ on the keyboard, it now turns those to comments. So it's a really nice way that you don't have an excuse to not include comments in your document, because you can just very easily Command/, makes it a comment, Command/ turns it off as a comment. As we're working with styles, two of the more common ones that we work with are background colors and text color. So those are two common ones that we will hit first. So as I do this, I can do something like body. Again, referencing an element. Looking back, I have a body tag right here, so I'm going to control how that body looks. And within my body, I'm going to set my background color. So in Atom, I start typing, and then I can just hit the down arrow to get to it. And now I can enter in the color. Now, the nice part about doing colors with CSS is we have a lot of options of how we want to encode our colors. So we can use hex color. We can use HSL. We can use RGB. We can do colors with alpha components. Now, the background color of the body, typically, we won't do it transparent, though there are some cool tricks where you can set an image on the HTML element, and then you put a background color of transparency on the body. So you can do some really cool, fun things with that, where we start overlaying transparencies. You get some pretty weird performance issues, but that's a different issue. Because we have installed Color Picker on the computer, I now have access to colors. So if I want my background color to be kind of a nice shade of blue, once I get the color I want, I can see across the bottom where I could choose hex, HSL, HSV, or VEC, which I don't even know what VEC is. So we can choose these colors and work with that, and then I can click on the color number that it's giving me, and then enter in a semicolon. So background dash color, colon, then RGB, and then now I have my color values. Now, if you don't like using Color Picker and want to just choose basic colors, if you remember on this first page, I chose red, I chose blue, and there's dozens of named colors available. So red, blue, green, purple, yellow, silver, gray, pink, teal, lime. I mean, there's all different colors you can choose, and you can just go nuts with it, and it's all good. And we can see how it now updated and put the blue color on my screen. So color is one of those common things. Remember, if you just use the word color, it's affecting the text. If we use the word background, we're affecting the background color of something. But that being said, I can certainly do something like paragraph background color, and I can now give the paragraph a background color. Let's pull up Color Picker. Oh, why not? I'll choose orange. Save that, and now we can see it put the background color of orange on my paragraph. By this, it's I want my headline to be on top of my paragraph. Okay, so we can see one is red, one is not, because one has an inline style. Both paragraphs do get the orange background on them. Nope, not that one. So now, while I'm over here in my paragraphs, along with the orange background, I could even do something like font. And if you look through the list here, wow, that's a whole lot of font things to choose from. So font dash. Remembering though, color is just the word color, but font dash, and then we can now affect size, style, weight, family, etc. So first I'm just going to go with the ubiquitous font size. When we choose sizes in CSS, we can use just about any unit of measure that makes you happy. But we shouldn't. But CSS understands just about every unit of measure. We just don't want to use them. So we can do things in pixel sizes. So we specify something as a certain number of pixels. And that's a common way of doing it. That's how we've been doing it for more than 20 years. It doesn't make it necessarily the best or the most correct or right way to do it, but it works. But it has some issues, as some devices, especially mobile devices, if you designate your font in pixels, that will preclude people being able to pinch zoom on your text. The text won't get bigger. Which, if the text is really small on screen and someone's looking at your page and they can't read it because they can't zoom in because you declared it in pixels, that's bad. That being said, there's many occasions where you will use pixels for it. Certain devices you will want to use pixels. So when we talk about what unit of measure to use, there's a lot of flexibility as to how we go about this. Some people have put a lot of work into it, and you can go research this online. It's a much deeper topic than we have time to get into right now. New kid on the block is viewport units. So imagine you're taking your screen and you're dividing it into 100 units. So it's kind of like percents, but the web browsers are happier with that. But the one that we've been using for the last number of years before viewport units came onto the market would be M, as in EM. So if I say I want my text to be 2EM, that means it's going to effectively be 200% or twice standard size. Now, what is standard size? That's dependent on what the user has set on their computer. Some of you, if you have bad eyesight, you may have made your text really big in your web browser so it's easier to read. So 2 M's will now make it twice that size. 1 M would be whatever size you've set it. And if you still have young super eyes, you may want everything small so you can see more on screen, and it's more elegant when you have all that negative space and tiny little letters. So then 2 M's for you may be a much smaller size. So M's is a proportional unit based on whatever the default has been set inside the user agent, aka web browser, that the person is using at that moment. Now that I've set my text to 2M, if I save this, we'll see how the text now got bigger on screen. We'll also notice that that seems to be pretty close to how big an H1 is by default. H1s typically are about 2 M's in size. But if we don't want our H1 to be that big, well, that's easy enough. I can make a style for my H1 here. And I can say font size 1.5 M. So we can use decimal versions of it. We can shrink it down. We can make it bigger. We have lots of flexibility as we go. Also notice, as anytime we are typing in font, we also have different variations. So headlines by default are going to be in bold. So if I go under font weight and decide I don't want my headline bolded but just want it to be normal or even lighter, I can select that. And now we can see how it made the text lighter as well on screen. So all of these things are properties of a given element that we can work with, that we can affect. We can change size, we can change weight, we can change color, we can change background colors. And if you're curious as to what different things are, you can start experimenting with it, which is what I would say is a really good way to go about doing it, because it starts to show you how you can try out different things. Text. So a common thing that people like to do is they want things centered, because somehow it makes people feel good inside when text is centered on screen. It just feels right. It feels special. It feels magical when that text is centered. Center my headline on here to get it on. What we end up being able to use is our text align option. You'll also notice I typed in text, and we've got a lot of other things showing up there. And I will once again encourage you to explore some of those as you work with it. And now once I have text align, I get center, and now I can save, and we can see that the text does indeed center itself across the screen. So that's the easy way to center it when we're putting it on screen. And if the window is bigger or the window is smaller, it still maintains its centering, which is pretty awesome. Now we're going to talk margins and padding. Margins and padding means we get to talk about the box model, we get to talk about spacing of elements and how elements have these properties inherent in them. The first thing that I'm going to do is just add in a generic rule in here that gives me a visual aid of what is happening. And this is where I'm going to use the wildcard tag, which says everything. So the star sign says everything. And I will say border. And I'm just going to make a 1 pixel solid red border. And I do that because it now puts a red border around everything on screen, so I can now see what constitutes the box of each one of these things. So this concept of the box model, every element is either an inline element or a box level element. So the paragraph itself is a box that contains the inline elements of characters, the little letters that we see. Each paragraph is its own box. We have a headline and 2 paragraphs. Those are contained within a box, this inner box here, which is for the body. The outer red box is for the HTML. So when we look at this, we can see what is going on and how it is showing up on screen. Now that I've done that, I'm going to start spacing things, moving things around, having some fun with it. A few words about putting in margins or padding. Margins exist outside of the border of an element. Padding exists inside. So if you notice when I put the background color on my paragraphs, the red border is touching that fill color. So now if I were to do something like padding, and if I just say the word padding, the number I follow it up with is going to apply to the padding on the top, the right, the bottom, and the left. Now we can see, okay, 5 is just a little bit too small. Let's do 20. Make it bigger. So we can see now it puts that spacing, and we can't really see much going on the edges because these objects aren't next to each other, so we're not seeing how they're necessarily interacting with each other just yet. So that puts some spacing around it. Now, if I put in a margin, we can see, actually let's make the margin even bigger so it pushes it in from the side. We can see how it now pushes it down, pushes that border in from the edges. So the margin is outside of the border, the padding is inside of the border. But typically when we have an element on screen, the border is what we consider the boundary of the object. And then margin just is that kind of that magical buffer space of where it's going to then move away from something else. Now an interesting thing happens in our CSS is that all objects inherently have a little bit of spacing around them. So when we start trying to do layout, which will be an upcoming unit shortly, all of our objects on screen by default have a little bit of margin and padding to them. So it's not uncommon that first I set it, my margin and my padding, to 0 for everything. Now when we do that, you can see that space that was automatically between elements disappeared. And when we zero it out, then when we add it back, we can control it. Because there's many times if you don't zero out your margin and padding first, then when we start trying to position things and get them to lay out on our page how we want it, they're off by like 5 pixels. And you'll pull your hair out trying to get it to move over those 5 pixels, and you'll add all kinds of extraneous garbage into your CSS to account for the fact that you're just fighting its default padding and margin. So you set it to 0, and then it tightens everything up, and then it's a little bit cleaner, and you're good to go. When we declare margin and paddings, besides doing all sides the same, we have an option. So I'm going to go into my paragraph, and I'll say padding. And if I put in 2 units of measure here, so I am going to give my top and bottom, I will give it a 30 pixel spacing, and my left and right, I'm going to give a 50 pixel space to. So if I put in 2 values instead of 1, it's then going to do top and bottom and then left and right. If I list 4 values, it does it in the order of trouble. Top, right, bottom, left. TRBL. So if I want 4 individual options, I can now type in 4 values. So I could go 30 pixels. So top, and then my right, I could go 20 pixels. And then my bottom, I could say 50 pixels. And my left, I can say 0. Now the thing about 0, 0 never needs a unit of measure. Because when it's 0, it doesn't matter. 0%, 0m, 0 pixels, 0 is simply 0. And now it moves things around. We can see how the top spacing is bigger than the bottom spacing. Make it more dramatic so we can see what's going on. So now you can start to see how we can do that. If you only want to affect, say, one of the properties, or not in that order, if you don't want to write out 4 that way, if you like writing things out longhand, you could just do padding left, 5 pixels. And now we can see it just moves it over 5 pixels. So if you're just doing one property, you just use that specific one. If you're going to be affecting 2 or 4 properties, then you use just the word padding and then you list it out. And margin will work in the same manner. So margin takes the same shortcuts as well as margin left, margin right, margin top, margin bottom. Changing the font is something that is pretty common. As designers, we get really sick of just using the basic typefaces that are present on the computer, and we want to update it so that we have something a little better to work with. Now, as we do that, we typically define the fonts that we want to load, the web fonts we want to use, at the beginning of our CSS. And the method we use is using the font face rule. So I type in @font face as part of this. So this is a little bit different because we have the @ sign or symbol and then font face. Now, as we're going to go through this, we get to name it how we want to use it. And we get to specify the name that we are going to use for our font. So if I, in this case, I'm going to say grunge. And then we get to specify how do we find it. So in doing this, we have to specify what is the name of the actual file that we are going to be loading. And forgot, we need to specify the source, then we specify the URL, which did it out of sequence. And I'll list my font again. Now, there are different formats we can use: TrueType fonts, EOF, TTF, WOFF. These are all different encodings for a font. Not all web browsers can read all encodings, and some web browsers on principle refuse to read specific encodings. So Firefox for a while refused to read any patent encumbered encodings of image files, video files, audio files, font files. It wanted everything to be in open source formats that fit with their philosophical view. And then there were some market share issues where people stopped using it, and then they said, okay, fine, we'll let you use those, but they did it begrudgingly. Now, the next thing we do is specify the format that we will be using, and on this, with the format, it is TrueType. So we've specified the name that we want to put on it. Now, to use it later on, so if in my paragraphs, I can now type in font family. And I'll type in the web font that I've loaded, but it's also a good idea to type in a backup. Now, the backup, you can see the default typefaces, Cursive Fantasy, Monospace, Sans Serif, and Serif are the default typefaces on the computer. So it will use, if you're on a Mac, for Sans Serif, you'll get Helvetica. Windows, you get Arial. Serif gives you your Times New Roman variants. Cursive gives you the Apple Chancery on Mac, and I don't know what the Windows scripty font is. But you can now choose whatever you want. So if I choose Sans Serif as part of it and put it in, and apparently, we missed one little thing somewhere because it's misbehaving at the moment. All right. So if we are using multiple formats, it's a nice idea to set it up. Okay, Beautify doesn't agree with me, but I personally think it looks a little bit easier to read if you have your different formats each on its own line. Because when you do that, it's much easier to verify your punctuation and that you've typed everything correctly. So if you have multiple formats, TTF, WOFF, EOT, or anything else, you separate them all with a comma. And after the final one, you do a semicolon. Notice my font family tag and font family tag are both referencing the same name. Now, if you look closely, you'll see the word grunge does not appear anywhere in the 1942 TTF file name. I just chose that. I could call it happy, and it would work as well. Reload the page, and we can see it's still showing up in that text. So that tells me I can name this font family when I use the @fontface tag anything I want, which is kind of fun. As part of your text, it asks you in one of the examples to use the Google font Limelight. So if I go into it and look at that font, we can see there is the font. So now if I want to use this font, I can click on it, and then that selected the font, and now down at the bottom where it said one family selected, I can see here is the information. Now the way that this works, we can see the standard method is we're going to use a link tag. Link tag, I am just going to copy this text. Pay attention to its limelight, capital I, or capital L as in lime. All right, so go over to Atom, go over to the head of my document. I'll paste that in. So that now shows me it's going to access the fonts.googleapis.com and grab limelight. Great. Save that, go into my style sheet over here, and I am going to tell my headline, I want my font family to be limelight or cursive. Save. Now if I go over to Chrome and pull it up, we can see how it changed the font to that new font. So once again, on Google, when you find a font you like, you click on the select this font. Now it gives it access at the bottom. You can click there and it shows you how to add it to your project. It's pretty slick.
So where do you put the link?
Working with our navigation, so I know I have my nav, then I have my unordered list within my nav. Now, if I only have one nav, if I only have one list within that nav, this works. But if my nav section has multiple navigation menus, so multiple lists within it, we may want to be more specific in how we're grabbing this element. And one of the things that you may have seen in your book, it talks about nav, then you see a caret and then UL. And what that does is that says we want to affect the first UL inside the nav. So the first child. So looking over here, UL is a child of nav. Nav is a child of body. Body is a child of HTML. So if we think about our document and look at it, so from my HTML tag goes all the way to close HTML. Within that we have head and body, which are both children of HTML. Within the body has a whole bunch of children. It has the H1, a couple paragraphs, and a nav. UL is the child of nav. List items are the children of the UL, or list. If you think in terms of parent-child relationship, it becomes much easier when we try to access or affect specific elements on our page. Now, the first thing that I want to do on my list here is I want to add in background color just for fun. Yeah, we'll go for black. Why not? And now if I try and change the color, it's probably not going to work terribly well. Well, I'm just going to get rid of the red borders for now because they are distracting at the moment. So I'll just comment that out. Now I can see here's my navigation. And I can't really see the dots. If we comment that out, then we can see my list does indeed have the bullets. But if I don't want the bullets on there, what we can say is list and then style type. Under style type, we can choose, well, we can use letters, numbers, squares instead. Oh, I could use squares. Look how cool this is. So we get squares instead of circles. Ooh. But the one we're really looking for is none. I put that in, boom, it goes away. Now, sometimes we don't want decoration, like an underline, on our link. And we can do that by setting the text decoration of our anchor tags to none. So we're doing a whole bunch of negation here. So now it's time to do something more positive. And as we are going to work in a more positive manner, I think we'll set the color of the text and work with that a little bit. So now, if I say nav ULA, we are going to introduce what is referred to as a pseudo class. Because the anchor tag is just the anchor tag, but the anchor tag has 4 properties available to it. It has an unvisited state, how the link looks before you get to it. It has the visited state, how it looks after you've gone to it. It has the hover state, which is when you're rolling your mouse over it, and the active state, which is what color it should be when you press down on it. So link, visited, hover, active. Love, hate. Now typing all of this in is really kind of annoying. So now we have link, and then I'll say nav ul a visited. Now, why didn't I just say a link and a visited? Because what if I have links elsewhere in my document? Would it affect them then? Yeah. So when we're doing our CSS, we generally are trying to be specific. So we'll do general things first, and then within each section, we then set the specific parameters of how do we want a link to look in the footer versus in the header versus in the navigation versus in a paragraph of text. In each one of those cases, we probably want it to be a different color. We may or may not keep the text decoration. We may want it to change to a visited color on links inside our paragraphs or our content. But our navigation, we probably don't want it to because that's going to look kind of junky over time. So now we'll choose a background color. And I'm going with garish colors instead of using color picker for in the interest of time. Really don't want to set the size on the anchor. I'd prefer to do it on the list item. So we'll just make a maybe I guess on the anchor tag after all. Oh yeah, we've got to space things out a little bit. So as you can see, when you start playing with stuff, you get some interesting there we go. Now I've spaced it out a little bit. Yeah, I guess. I'll leave it. You have to change something else to get that to work. You can't really see the gray, can you? It's pretty brutal to read. Oh well. But we'll make the rollover have more pop. Now this is one of those copy-paste elements where now I'm going to change this to hover and active. Now if we don't change the background color, I'll just change it to white when we roll over it. And you can see now I have the rollover effect occurring. Now if I want my background color to change, So we can change the background and the text color. If you follow the examples in your textbook, they do a nice job using more subtle color combinations, but that takes a little bit more time to think through how you want your colors to be. But the key thing is that we're able to set this using these pseudo classes of link visited, hover, and active, love, hate, as part of how we go about doing this. So it's very common to set the properties of multiple elements using a comma to separate those apart. So we do the link and visited together and hover and active together. Classes, and we work with IDs. Classes are things where we can apply a class to something, and we can apply that same class to any number of elements in our document. So I can have class equals green. So class designation goes inside the markup along with any IDs and classes we put in the markup. They give us another way to access or hook our elements, and they don't have to be only on the same kind of thing. So I've applied the class equals green to my H1 and to my first paragraph. Now if I save this and define what that is, and in our style sheet, we reference a class by using a dot. We put a dot in front of its name. If we're going to reference an ID, we would put a hashtag in front of its name. So I'm just using background colors as a really easy way to see how this works. And we can see that now the H1 and that first paragraph have the green background. That paragraph previously had an orange background. Now I haven't put purple on anything yet, but if I go into my second paragraph, I'll just say ID equals purple. And now we can see it too gets a beautiful colored background. Using nth of type, specify which item, paragraph 1, 2, 3, and now that allowed me to change that text while leaving the other paragraphs untouched. Beyond nth of type, if we look at it, we'll see that there is a lot of other nths that we can choose. And if you go through your textbook, you'll find that it gives you a lot of insight into how to go about using these different selectors as part of it. So these are just a number of the options that are available to you when you are working with it. Nth of type is probably the most common one that we use. Along with our pseudo classes, then we are able to access our pseudo elements. Again, in your book, starting page 145, continuing on, it talks about pseudo classes and pseudo elements, and we can do a couple of different things with it. Pseudo class, so I grab the first of type, the paragraph, then I'm going to go grab the first line within it. So the key thing on pseudo classes is they don't exist in the markup until the page is loaded, and then when the content gets loaded, it now is able to access the pseudo element, in this case the first line of that text, and then we could change that first line to, in this case, a font variant of small caps. Key things to notice: paragraph, colon, and then we have our designation of our pseudo class. We use 2 colons to designate we're going to be using a pseudo element. We'll have a little bit more on pseudo elements shortly. We'll create a pseudo element, not just a pseudo class here, and I'll say paragraph. Actually, I'm going to say body paragraph. So the caret says I want the first paragraph in the body, so where it says howdy. Now I'm going to put in 2 colons, and then I'll type in the word before, put in my curly braces, and I can now type in the word content, put a colon, and now at this point I can add anything. And when I say that, I mean literally I can add anything. So if I want to add a new word, a fun greeting is, and now it added those words, it added that content to that element. So in my markup that doesn't exist, but in my style sheet it's now adding in that information. Normally we don't add in whole words. What is more commonly done is we add in special characters. So we add in escape characters. We looked at escape characters in the previous class session where we have all those fun and fancy sorts of things. And what we would add in would be, say, a left quote and a right quote. So I'm putting a left double quote. I'm going to make it really big. We'll save that. OK. Let's try again. Oh. So using open quote, but we'll make it a little smaller. That now puts a quote at the beginning. Now if we repeat the same thing, but do after, and now this will be a close quote. So now it adds the quotes. So the advantage of doing this is we're able to style these and control them so that it's done separately from the markup, because it would be very difficult to make these quotes big, the rest of the word smaller like that. Now, I also want to even change this and go font family and with the serif, because serif fonts always have better looking quotes, but those aren't the right quotes that I want. But we'll worry about that in a little bit. There's a pseudo class of first child. All right, not quite sure why first child's not working, but first of type, so the first paragraph after body, and then we append it with the before and after, and it gives us the quotes, change their size. We could even change their color. So it's now in a different color from the text. So the advantage of using this pseudo element is it allows us to add little decorative elements in that aren't important for the content of our page, but they do help with the visual presentation of the page. Remembering that CSS is about presentation. The markup is about structuring your content. So if we think that about how there's a separation of powers. So we have the markup, which is the structure of the document, the content that goes into that markup, and then the CSS, which controls the visual display of that information. If there's something that's not actual real content, like hanging quotes around a quote that someone has put on your page, that's decorative. The order matter for the CSS as I write it. So I have my caret at the top. I said do your font faces at the top. After that, I didn't really talk about the order. Eventually, you'll want to structure and order your CSS in some type of logic so you can just find it. But when you create it and are designing your page, it's usually just you're hacking it in and you just put in rule after rule after rule in whatever order it kind of comes to your mind of, okay, I'm doing some backgrounds. Oh, I'm doing some text color. Oh, I'm doing some layout. And you don't even really pay attention to that order until it's done. And then you go back and change it around and make it look prettier and also make it easier to follow. But there are certain things where the order will matter. Because if you put your font face at the end, but you try and use it, it won't know about it. So if one of your rules asks to use the font face tag, so it's trying to access that font family, but you defined it later, it's not going to be able to find it because when it tried to access it, it wasn't in memory yet. Now, it's also possible that my paragraphs by default, they have font family of happy, blah, 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 and we can see the final one is doing that. But now if I go all the way down to the bottom, if I were to put in another paragraph tag and say background color red, we'll see that now it's red, but up here I said it was supposed to be orange. So which is it? Well, whatever happens later takes precedence over what happened earlier. There are some kind of nuances and details of this that sometimes you'll put in a style and it's not working, and what you've written is a perfect textbook correct style rule. You're like, this should work. And potentially what's happening is one of your other styles is conflicting with it. So a practice that when things are really not working, comment everything out except the one thing you're trying to see if that's working and make sure that rule works. And if it works when everything else is commented out, that means you have conflict. And then you have to find where that conflict is. A lot of what we're doing in the beginning, that's not going to be a pressing issue. But when you start trying to create complex web pages, it can be an issue. If you're working on a client project where you have been given multiple style sheets, it could be an issue. Because some projects, instead of worrying about what's in the existing style sheets, the designer makes a new style sheet to try and override everything that they want to change. So instead of changing what's already there, they just ignore it and try and override over the top of it. And that works the first time. But then when the next person, because you get promoted because you did such a good job, you get promoted, and then that next starving web designer comes in and they have to try and override your styles that are overriding someone else's styles, and eventually the whole thing breaks. And whoever is the unlucky sap that happens to is the one that everyone's like, shame on you. But it works. We always find a way to work through it. But it's not uncommon on projects that have been through multiple iterations that people eventually say, let's start fresh.